Our language of conversation is English today, and I'm very glad to introduce to you our guests today, very important international guests. I don't know how many persons here have heard something about microhistory. Have you heard something about this? Nothing. No one, and nothing. So it's quite correct. So it's one of the situations that we have here. You will know many interesting things I hope today. First of all, there are two specialists, great specialists in microhistory, international specialists of microhistory who we have invited here. And I should say that in some senses the heads, two heads, you know, this eagle with two heads. So the microhistory is like an eagle with two heads. And both of them are here. First of all, they have studied microhistory, they have practiced microhistory, and they know everything about microhistory. More than any of microhistorians who founded the microhistory. You know Carlo Ginzburg, maybe you have heard this name, Carlo Ginzburg, maybe you have heard even Giovanni Levi, but they both, they know only one or two things about microhistory. This is the title of one article of Carlo Ginzburg, not more. But the colleagues you see here know everything much more than Carlo Ginzburg. And they have founded also the International Microhistory Network, and you can find it in your laptops if you tip there microhistory point EU, Europe, microhistory Europe, and you will see the whole list of microhistorians from all possible countries, and also the lecture of Carlo Ginzburg, or interview of Carlo Ginzburg, given to some American or English correspondent, and he did this in the room 208, just level beyond us. It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you, first of all, Sigurður Gylfi Magnusson, the professor at the Iceland University at Reykjavik, and István Szijártó, professor at the university, the main university of Budapest, the State University of Budapest. If you think that Central European University is the main university at Budapest, it is absolutely incorrectly. You should not make this fault anymore. So this is the University of Budapest, and they both are authors of a very important book that was lost somewhere here. I think it is somewhere.
Here it is.
Here it is. A very important book with a very important and very persuasive title. The title is "What is Microhistory?" And they have launched a great program of publishing of a series of books concerning microhistory, at least the same Routledge publishing house. And Sigurður Gylfi will tell you just now something about this project, I think. And you should begin.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for Sjá. It's very nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to have some dialogue with you and colleagues here from doing microhistory. Do you hear my voice right there? Okay. I might actually sit down a little later because my back, I hurt my back, but I'm going to stand a little to begin with. So the question is, what is microhistory? And that's what István and I have been dealing with now for a number of years. And needless to say, we do disagree what microhistory is all about. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that and run through the major ingredients of microhistory as I see them. First, I'm going to introduce myself a little. My scholarly autobiography. I got my education in my home country, Iceland, and went then to America and got my PhD there. After I returned back, I became the president of the Icelandic Historical Association and formed a school or a research center, which is called the Reykjavik Academy, which is from people from the social sciences and humanities. And it was an independent research institute. We started out 10 of us, and a year later we were 40, and we ended up 80. And there are 80 people there now, scholars doing research, and approximately 600 people have traveled through the institutions from 1998 when we formed it. I mention this specifically because two of these elements of phenomena became kind of a forum for a new way of approaching history, both the Icelandic Historical Association and also this Reykjavik Academy. These are some of my publications, and a lot of them have to do something with echo documents or private sources, autobiographies, letters, collections of letters, or diaries, stuff like that, which is we have the Icelandic popular culture throughout the centuries has produced a lot of echo documents, and that's the reason we have actually, we who have focused on echo documents, are interested in echo documents, we have actually used microhistory to deal with often very complicated sources to get some kind of a conceptual framework for our research. This book here was Wasteland with Words, was published in England 2010 and deals with 300 years history of Iceland from the 18th, 19th and 20th century. And when I got an offer to write the book, I was in the process of actually condemning those who are doing national histories, criticizing them for that synthesis didn't really work. But when I got the offer, I kind of said to myself, well, this is too good to be true. I need to kind of try to take it on and write a different kind of history, not this typical national history, but more history with focus on microhistory. And I think I succeeded in that. This is something which I'm very proud of. I established a book series which is called The Anthology of Icelandic Popular Culture, and in 1997, and we are publishing now the 19th book, this one here, which deals with poor people and poor relief in the late 19th century into the 20th century in Iceland. A lot of this has to do with echo documents again, and there are excerpts from documents, and and there are a lot of my students have taken their first steps as authors in this book series. And we are increasing the speeds of the publications. Now we are planning to actually publish 2 books a year. But I am one of 3 editors, Már Jónsson, Professor Már Jónsson, a very good friend of mine, a professor at the University of Iceland, and also Dr. David Olafsson, who we all know, Mikael knows too. These are my forthcoming books. These are the books which we have already been talking about. These books are forthcoming in Routledge Minor Knowledge. I'm going to give a talk on the topic next week, Minor Knowledge and Microhistory. And then I'm writing a book with my wife. It's some people said it's a suicide mission to write a book with your wife, but we are still determined to actually finish it, and it deals with childhood in global perspective. And Istvan and I, we just started a book series for Routledge, which is called the Microhistories, and we are in the process of publishing our first books, maybe next year. 3 or 4 books are planned, and which we hope will be on our agenda very soon. And there are a lot of manuscripts in the making, and if you have a good idea, by all means write us and let us know. We are interested to publish books from all corners of the world, and especially people on the periphery, so to speak, Scandinavia, Asia. We can't really talk about it as a periphery, but not necessarily Anglo-Saxon or European books. By all means, stop me if you need some further explanation. Just to get an idea of what we are talking about here, social cultural history are of course formed or were established in connection with what we might call in harmony with changes in society. And this is of course a very well-known fact. But what characterizes these waves, they all focused on the group, and the individual was kind of left behind. And this was something which I studied under a professor called Peter Stearns, who was one of the big social historians in America, and the focus was all on the class or the ethnicity or race on the group, but when the individual was kind of left behind. This is a diagram I'm going to throw up, which is actually in the book, and the Eastman knows quite well. This is kind of as I see how social history and cultural history developed. What is interesting here is the third level. You could actually argue that the history of mentality should be up there. It's the French way of doing social history, so to speak. But I decided to keep it down there because I do think that the history of mentality kind of failed in their mission to do history in a productive manner. History from the below, as we know it from England or the English-speaking world, Alltagsgeschichte, the German way of doing everyday life history, and then microhistory. And the movement is from the group to the individual. And these are on the fourth and the fourth and the fifth level. We have basically ingredients like political history, popular culture, ethnology, demography, and anthropology, which kind of have affected, for example, microhistory, Alltagsgeschichte, or history from below quite a lot. And it depends on, of course, countries or individuals where you draw your intellectual what stimulates you intellectually, if you can say so. I'm going to run very quickly through the classical themes in microhistory. You who know are familiar with microhistory. A lot of this will be familiar with you. These are the main ingredients: source material and its subjectivity. On the periphery, the normal exceptions. There are actually two ways of using that phenomena. First of all, it gives you an opportunity to look at those who actually break the law, and the dialogue between those who actually break the law and those who actually define what is right and wrong. You pick out those who are, kind of have a record of their life, so to speak, and often because they have stepped out of the norm. The reduction of the scale of observation. This is one of the characteristics of microhistory, obviously. You reduce the scale and focus on something very intensely. The matter of agency is an important one, and connections between the big and the small units. That's something which is a very classical question in history, of course. The question of representation. When is a research unit too big, or when is it too small? And that's something which Eastman and I are kind of disagree on that point, as I will point out a little later. And let's go now through some of these ingredients. The role of the narrative, of course, is a very, very important one. And what actually microhistorians put an emphasis on is that the gap in our sources, in our knowledge, is as important as the data we are working with. And that's an important point to understand. To actually work with the stuff which we don't really know anything about. Historical synthesis is another one. And I'm all for theoretical synthesis, just like our book is. It is a theoretical synthesis. But I am skeptical about narrative synthesis, the idea of an overview, just like I told you before. So it is, of course, something to think about. The question of, it is really the question of scale. I mean, how big is research, how important it is to have a big research unit, or how important is it to have a small one? The importance of the size is what matters. And this is, of course, a relevant topic for those who are doing global history, for example, which is kind of the new topic in the microhistorical research. Does microhistory fit into the global perspective? Fiction. Historians, of course, state their case, tell the story in an interesting way. That's one of the appeal of microhistory. Ginsberg, of course, uses in his famous article, 2 or 3 things I know about microhistory. He uses Tolstoy there, War and Peace, where the author actually has the whole sequence of events in his hand. And but I think the microhistorians is always conscious about the limitation of the source material, which is the next one I was going to discuss a little bit. And the name of the game is really the way how the microhistorian deals with the relationship between, first of all, the one who makes the sources, the one who uses it, and the one who interprets, puts an interpretation and reading on the material. And this is something which microhistorians are always very conscious about. This is really, in my point of view, the name of the game. Can I ask the audience, just for the fun of it, are you familiar with these books I put out there? I'm sorry about that. This is my physical therapist. He was going to give me good advice about my back. Are you familiar with these books? Some of them, yeah. I actually break all the rules in terms of PowerPoint presentation. I decorate with books. Some of them have something to do with the stuff I'm talking about, but also some of them are important in terms of microhistory and the development of microhistory. But why actually microhistorians take the outliers? Why are they focusing on the outliers? And I think the reason is that the outlier, those who actually commit a crime, for example, like in this book here, History from Crimes, they actually leave sources behind. I mean, that is a good reason. Like the scientists kind of want to shy away from the outlier, but the microhistorians want to focus on them. It opens up an opportunity to kind of deconstruct the relationship between the outlying unit and the center. And it actually identifies how society functions, because those who are in power are always in some kind of a dialogue with the outlying unit. So the reduction of the scale of observation. It is basically, microhistorians try to avoid the determinate factor of historical institution, the institutionalization of the discipline. Because like in America, social history in America has developed that the institutions of social history has kind of defined what is an important topic and what is not an important topic. And if you stay at an American university for a semester or two and they are hiring people, you see what kind of type of people they hire. It's people that fit into this large scheme of things. The people they think actually can teach more students than, for example, microhistorians would do. They would focus on the big topics. So they start eventually, it's not an elaborate scheme, but eventually they start to actually have an effect on how the discipline develops. And I saw this over and over again. I asked a colleague, a friend of mine, who was hiring people at the department I was staying in 2002 as a Fulbright scholar, and I said, why don't you just hire someone who is flaky, who's strange, bizarre, who does something really out of the blue, who's different than any other? And he just looked at me and said, what are you talking about? Because they wanted to have someone who could teach the big courses, Western civilization, the history of the Mediterranean, or something which would attract a large number of students. I think microhistory is a kind of an answer to this. It gives you an alternative. It works against the institutionalization of the discipline, and it's a very appealing element of microhistory from my point of view. And because microhistory is something which can bring the research closer to the reader. We are dealing with people, we are dealing with interesting sources which kind of reflect on your own personal life. And if that is something history shouldn't really do, I don't know what history should do. What is the goal of history? Agency, individual. I think microhistorians are very concerned with the normative behavior or actual behavior. Law and order places certain limitations on people's life, and we assume that they follow them. In a lot of historical studies, for example, a lot of social historians, they look at the normative behavior without actually ever asking what does the actual behavior been all about. The history of everyday life has a different approach, and I think, for example, this German concept, Eigensinn, actually gets it really well, because it really directs us to the elements in every single individual, that we take steps which are not very rational. We make decisions which might actually harm us or harm other people. And history is full of that kind of elements, and Eigensinn actually is something which I think microhistorians are looking for in each individual. This, of course, has affected history writing in America, especially anthropology, ethnology, thick description, the Great Cat Massacre, of course. How many actually know Downton's The Great Cat Massacre?
Probably everybody.
Everybody, okay.
The book was translated.
Oh, okay, all right, good. Well, it's, of course, incredibly important, extremely important book. And Robert Downton, one of the most important American historians from my point of view. And I think it has had a huge influence on American scholarship, even though he is a French historian. He was the president of the American Historical Association. And so it had a huge difference on just how microhistory developed. The Great Cat Massacre is one of the books which is usually mentioned when we talk about microhistory, even though I don't think Robert Downton looked at himself necessarily as a microhistorian. Contextualization, one of the characteristics of most microhistorical work. We study very intensely something which we decide to focus on, but the name of the game is actually to connect it to the larger structures. This dialogue between the micro and the macro, that's something which I think generally microhistorians are very, very concerned about, with one exception at least, and that's myself. Before I talk about the singularization of history, this research model which I have been introducing, I'm going to talk to my colleague here, talk about the Szijártó. Can you see the? It's a good photo of you here. And when we wrote the book, What is Microhistory, we almost didn't know exactly how we approach microhistory. We had known each other from 2006, and our dialogue was, of course, very, we were colleagues, and we were interested in the same thing. But I felt that I didn't really know exactly what the microhistory Istvan was focusing on, what it was all about. I'd read some of his articles, and I'd read all his articles in English, but of course a lot of it was written in his mother tongue. But when we basically decided to split up the book, he would take the first part, and I would take the second part. He would focus on the historiography of microhistory, and I would focus more on the methods, the theory, and the current times. This changed a little bit. I did some historiography, and he did some theory and stuff. But what we did, we wrote each part, and then we switched and read each other part with a very critical eye. And I was kind of shocked when I read Istvan's part, because I didn't really understand, that the difference between us was so great. So I thought kind of the project was, we had a problem. But we solved it I think very well, in the sense that we decided to have at least two voices in the book. And we spoke very openly about it in the introduction, that the reader would actually get two different opinions on what microhistory is all about. And how I see it is that there are actually three elements in Istvan's introduction to microhistory. It's of course the micro focus on small communities, individual or event, what he called the great historical questions, and agency. And what I of course could I accepted, of course, the first part and the third part, but what I didn't really understand was his insistence on every single microhistory study had to focus on great historical question. And I still don't, because I don't think I have ever asked a small historical question. I think all questions are kind of great historical questions. Even though you're talking about the 1 minute in the life of some regular person, I think the question which you asked about the 1 minute he lives needs to be a great historical question. So I, from my point of view, with full respect of course, I don't really understand how great historical question can actually determine what microhistory is all about. But I guess Istvan wants to make sure that we actually hook the small unit we are focusing on with larger structures. But that's where the difference between us is. I actually make a point that we should actually cut on the ties between the larger units. We should only focus on the small unit. And I realize this is a very radical suggestion. What I am talking about here is the grand narrative and how it actually determined how we look at history. It doesn't really determine how we look at history, it determines the questions we ask and determines the outcome of our research, whether we want to accept it or not. when I was in America, I subscribed to Journal of Social History. And when I got each issue to my home, I looked at the cover and looked at the content of it, and I saw the articles, and I could more or less say exactly what the article was all about. Each article was all about. Because that's how I was trained. I was trained to understand the different arguments in different schools of thought. And I realized that this guy is approaching it as a Marxist, he's approaching it as a functionalist, he's approaching it with some other methodology. And when we are, kind of doomed to follow the grand narratives, we actually, it's very, very hard for us to actually get away from the heavy hand of the grand narrative. And I think microhistory gives us an opportunity to do that, even though it's not an easy task for sure. And that's how the singularization of history comes in. And the focus is basically on the research project at hand. And I do want to say that I look at myself as a heavy critic of microhistory. I'm critical of a lot of stuff which has been written in microhistory, because I do think microhistorians do not live up to the potential which microhistory has, because we are so often we have our one eye on the research topic and the other eye on the larger unit around us. We want to hook it up with how the functionalists talk about history, how the Marxists talk about it, or whatever what methodology we want to use. But the focus is on the research unit itself. You can compare it with similar research unit, or the comparison is basically within the research unit you are making. And the main thing is that the grand narrative is rejected. And this is kind of the practical demonstration of the model, how you kind of do it. But secondly, this is the textual environment. That's another research method where I go deep into the sources, where you actually take each source and you analyze it not only of contents, but also the environment where it was made, how it was used. And this gives you it's what I would call a living research model, and this gives you a great information which will help you to analyze societies from past times. Information which because we are so often into the grand narrative, we kind of look away, passes us because it doesn't really fit our profile as scholars. It is the textual space which I'm going to be the textual whole, which is my focus of my research. And I think this is it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
As you know, in the 1930s, the double-headed eagles on the tops of the Kremlin's towers have been replaced by big red five-pointed stars. And while I thank heartily for this invitation to Professor Kamensky and Professor Baitsov, I think about him likening microhistory to a double-headed eagle, one of its heads being Sigurdur Gylfi, the other being myself. We are looking into different directions. And since now here, we are both in Moscow, I really wonder who in this story the big red five-pointed star will be. Sigurdur Gylfi to some extent spoke about myself in his presentation, and you might interpret our relationship as opposition. He mentioned that when our project about this book, What is Microhistory, was underway, and we exchanged criticisms of each other's parts, he was in a shock. And actually, before sending him my criticism about part 2 of the book, about his part, I actually emailed his wife because I was afraid, sending him directly my opinion that he would get a heart attack.
To ask her to divorce me, no.
And as for my wife, she often asked me, because I was getting this job from Routledge first, to write a book about microhistory as a whole. And I then asked them whether I could share the job with Szijártó Gylfi and do it together. So my wife asked me if I really had a good decision. Because we were in a friendly relationship, and that was conflict. Is it good to have a conflict in such a relationship? So, as I say, you might interpret our relationship as opposition, but there is another way. You might interpret it as complementarity. He was standing, I'm sitting, he's a big man, I'm not. His PowerPoint was white, mine was black. And he was speaking about microhistory as it has been, and I'm going to speak about something which is in the future, about the plan. I still prefer to interpret our relationship in the terms of complementarity. And in the introduction of this blue book, I included a joke from the 1990s. At that time in Hungary, a metro line was constructed, and the joke ran like this. They announced an international tender, and the firms had the obligation to present projects in which the tunnel is drilled from 2 opposite directions. And the German firm comes with a proposal that they can make these 2 tunnels meet with 6 centimeters of difference. The Japanese say that we can make it with a difference of 12 millimeters. And the Russian firm says, oh, well, you might end up with 2 tunnels. So I think that readers of this book might end up with 2 different interpretations of microhistory, and this is after all good for microhistory, to have different views, to have a discussion, to have a discourse going on. So, 16 years ago, a friend and colleague stood up at the end of a lecture of mine, giving an overview of microhistory, saying, all this is very well, but how to write a microhistory of Hungary? By now, I think I have the answer, and in this paper, I will try to explore the possibilities of microhistory in presenting a national history. First and foremost, I'm a historian of the 18th century, so the subject will be conveniently this. I shall try to show how microhistory can be integrated into general history and how it might enhance its power of persuasion. However, I'm going to present you a blueprint, a plan of research still to be done, the underlying ideas of a book still to be written, so it is a recipe and not a dish. What we need first is a familiarity with the period in question. And interestingly enough, the challenges and exigencies of teaching might serve us better here than the complete freedom of research. I have been teaching at Eötvös University, Budapest, for 22 years. But since I'm at the Department of Economic and Social History, I have mostly taught a great variety of seminars for small groups of students with active student participation. And as for lectures, mine were mainly about historiography and methodology. So although I have been studying various aspects of the history of Hungary in the 18th century as a researcher for a quarter of a century, it was only 2 years ago that I had to hold a series of comprehensive lectures on this subject. This way, I was confronted by the problem how to put all the advantages of microhistory to use, about which I have been writing for 2 decades, when I have the duty to present an overall picture of a complete period of national history to students. To cut the long story short, the first step is to identify the areas which should be presented to the readership. Then, to sketch the major developments and identify the crucial points. Using the expression which I employed in my definition of microhistory, the task is to identify the great historical question. Then, as a second step, the cases have to be found that have adequate documentation and which seem to be promising in the sense that when subjected to a microhistoric investigation, they might furnish us with answers to these questions. Since it is only after decades of studying a certain historical period that the first step can be made, which is the mapping of the field and the identification of the main problems, making the second step does not mean in practice that we go to the archives with great historical questions on our minds, desperately trying to find some well-documented case that may for some obscure reason give us exactly the answers to these questions, but it is rather choosing one of the cases already well known to us. So let me suggest the following four main areas, subject matters to be addressed when writing the microhistory of 18th century Hungary: economy, society, state, and time. If we now go deeper and try to grasp the main historical developments and problems, these can come to mind. First, as for economy, agriculture, market, capital accumulation, and credit. Second, as for society, peasantry, serfdom, or the right to move, mobility, demography and repopulation, everyday culture, and the wide stratum of petty nobility, and finally the set of relationships with the state, that is between the state and the mass of the population. And this brings us to subject matter number 3, the state. And here, focus should be first on the county, that is the state close, and then on the kingdom and the empire, the state afar, also on public affairs or politics. And the last subject area to be covered is time, tradition on the one hand, and change on the other, of course. And evidently, I have more or less clear ideas where problems lie in these historical subject areas and developments. But my plan is not to name these to readers, rather to pick a case so that the problems of the main historical developments of 18th century Hungary would be exposed in the future book in a very concrete and precise fashion in a specific situation among specific conditions, embedded in an elaborate context. Then, I shall try to conduct a micro-investigation, an analysis in depth. Since this will not be the first time meeting the case, but it will be the first time to try to explore it writing microhistory, it might or might not bring new results. Even for myself, it has to be seen. The microanalysis will finally not only expose the problem, but also suggest an answer to this, an answer to the great historical question. Let me add a footnote to this train of thought. Since first the case will be exposed, and then the context drawn up, and finally the answer to the problem will be suggested, readers will get the impression that the case explored is situated exactly in the center of gravity of the given historical subject. It might occur to you that what happens here is simply a trick played to the readers. I have an a priori general conviction. I still write a book in which historical knowledge seems to be born out of a microanalysis in front of the eyes of the reader. But I think that this is not the case. It is not a trick. What happens here is the exact replication of the formative moment in the process of the creation of historical knowledge. I namely pick out the case that used to suggest me, at the time of its first original analysis, the vague idea that has later turned into a firm conviction. That is, in the book, I just try to replay for the readers the moment in which the answer to the great historical question was actually born. And now let me unfold my plan of action. Let me present you what the planned microhistory of the 18th century Hungary would look like. But of course, this is not a sketch. Not only are my ideas somewhat vague about the structure of this book and how to reason for my thesis, but also I have only a couple of minutes to present ideas that should fill a complete book. This is the reason why not all the historical problems are raised here, and no argument is sufficiently elaborated. Let me start with the first example of Hungarian microhistory, Lajos Für's book, The Riot in Berzel. He, the author, sets out to explore why did a landlord beat another half dead on the 23rd of May 1784 in the village of Berzel in eastern Hungary, when allocating lots for the peasants to cultivate watermelon. Lajos Für explores a hitherto hardly known world to answer his question. On reaching the end of his book, the reader's sympathies are overturned. We find out that the victim of slight build, Lajos Olasz, was a ruthless exploiter, while his strong assailant, Boldizsár Bessenyei, appears to be an impoverished representative of patriarchal approach, defending villagers, defending peasants from Olasz. The integration of Hungary into the monarchy of the Habsburgs is a multifaceted issue. It cannot be summed up short. It has its military, political, constitutional aspects, but also an economic aspect. Since the end of the 15th century, Hungary was integrated into the world economy as a semi-periphery, especially by supplying agricultural produce. Selling grain would be the greatest of all businesses from the mid-19th century, when the coming of railways made transportation possible, but only then. In the above-mentioned conflict in Berzel, Bessenyei told the peasants that Olasz would bring the porció on you. Porció, or portion, was the amount of foodstuffs due to a soldier or his horse in a month. It was common practice that the Habsburgs stationed their armies in Hungary in peacetime, for food there was cheaper. It also means that a part of the Western European market, still unreachable in the period, moved into Hungary itself. As the saying goes, if the mountain doesn't go to Muhammad, then Muhammad goes to the mountain. Although it might not be clever to joke about Muhammad in these days. So it was possible, even feasible, that Lajos Olasz was an innovator in agriculture and tried to maximize the agricultural output of his lands, made steps that an army unit should be stationed in Berzel, since this would have entailed a whole range of problems for the inhabitants. Certainly, it was no way a popular idea among them. This short sentence suggests, however, that a hitherto unexplored interest might have been at work in the integration of Hungary into the monarchy of the Habsburgs, usually interpreted in categories of national suppression and economic colonization. Writing any kind of microhistory would be anything more appropriate than taking a miller's case as a starting point. But my Hungarian miller is no Menocchio with an amazing knowledge of books and even more fantastic views that do not actually originate from these books. János Schmick, my miller, was just a poor victim. On the 5th of March 1798, in the northwestern county of Veszprém, the miller of Ihar-forráskút of the village of Inota was brutally murdered by a gang which robbed his house. In the resulting trial, an inventory of his complete wealth was taken to ensure that the orphan's interests were subsequently observed. It becomes clear that it was no chance. that the robbers picked János Schmick as their target, he was a very wealthy man indeed. He had 15,000 forints, but more than 80% of his complete wealth was loaned out on interest. His main client was the same Count Zichy. From him, Schmick leased the mill. This case gives us a chance to think about the economy, practically the agriculture of 18th century Hungary. I cannot go into detail here, but it can be shown that the critical point was the feudal legal system, which made noble landowners into mere users of their land. They were not allowed to alienate landholdings, since other members of the family, future members, and far-off relatives included, had also a right to possession, with the King of Hungary standing at the end of the queue, having a final claim to the land, in case this noble family died out. With this principle, in Hungarian ősiség, in Latin habiticitas, in force, landholdings could not serve as security on loans, and without credit in agriculture, the Hungarian economy could not be modernized. This turned out to be the key issue of Hungarian politics in the first half of the 19th century. This is the mainstream historical narrative. But if we look at the Miller's case, we learned that he was able to accumulate between 1791, when his first wife died, and the first inventory was taken of his possessions, and 7 days later, that is his death, when the second inventory was taken. So he was able to accumulate 7,600 forints, doubling his wealth, by managing the single mill which was leased from the landowner. To give you some indication, as for the value of this amount, the salary of the official, the noble official, who practically ran the county, the so-called ordinarius vicecomes, it was something between 600 and 800 forints a year in Hungary in this period, which makes 4,200 or 5,600 forints for 7 years, an amount inferior to this miller's incomes. Schmick had returns of more than 10% each year on his complete wealth. For loans, 5 or 6% was usual. Much of this may have been of usury, the result of usury. But his first capital came from his mill, and the interests on his loans were subsequently paid by other actors of agriculture. This suggests to me that the capacity of Hungarian agriculture to accumulate capital under the so-called feudal regime is significantly underrated, and the actual working of the financial system should be investigated in depth. In 1766-67, the county of Somogy in southwestern Hungary had to face a strange legal conflict. First, a landowner and his widow submitted complaints against the postmaster of Babócsa, who sold wine in the village, gravely hurting the landowner's rights and financial interests. It was clear that peasants had no right to sell wine in this village after Christmas. But the status of the postmaster was unclear. He claimed nobility, which was reputedly a lie. He was an employee of a royal service, and he had a little land on which the horses of the postal service were grazing. In Hungary, noble privilege and the political system built on the Hungarian estates' rights survived up to the revolution of 1848. This usually suggests to historians that society was stable, or at least it was imprisoned into an old legal framework that is usually termed as feudal. But the postmaster case proves the inability of this old legal structure to deal with new developments. The county asked the Queen, Maria Theresa, I quote, to restrain the postmaster of Babócsa to his rightful competences. But the Queen threw the ball back to the county of Somogy, asking which these competences were. Both local and central authorities seemed to be helpless facing new developments that had no set place in this traditional society. They were no doubt at work eroding old social structures. If we, however, go back to the Berzel case, it will be evident that forces of old and new were not easily distinguishable from each other. They were not historical players like white and black pieces on a chessboard. In Berzel in 1784, it was clearly the landlord beaten, Lajos Olasz, who was the representative of progress in agriculture. His opponents, the impoverished Bessenyei family, represented old traditional forms of production and patriarchy in their attitude to peasants. But Boldizsár's brother, György Bessenyei, who didn't take part in the beating up of Lajos Olasz, but who participated in other conflicts with him, György Bessenyei was a playwright. The iconic figure of Hungarian Enlightenment, whose first play actually marks the beginning of Enlightenment in Hungary in 1772. He was former member of Empress Maria Theresa's Hungarian Noble Guard in Vienna, just like his brother Boldizsár was in fact. Traditional noble mentality and Enlightenment were fully compatible for them. In January 806, the runaway soldier György Horváth was detained in the village of Kaposmérő in the home of a noble landowner, Mária Talján, widow of a former ordinarius vicecomes of the county. György Horváth was a young gypsy who was her former cook and lover at the outrage of the local population. He had left the village having taken a cartload of booty of mostly bed clothes and female clothes with himself. He actually claimed that he had got everything from his mistress, but on Mária Talján's order, 3 serfs were following him to the neighboring county. Caught there, György Horváth was willing to give back some of the spoils, goods allegedly worth 500 or 600 forints, but rejected returning 500 forints in cash, which Mária Talján wanted back most. He claimed that he had earned it with his sexual services. When he reappeared in the village in the January of 1806 as a deserter, peasants spotted him. The peasant spotting him was actually the serf of the retired army general Ignác Talján, another landlord and a distant relative to Mária. This serf reported György Horváth's appearance in Kaposmérő to his master, and Ignác Talján wanted to find out about it. So he sent another serf to Mária Talján, giving her notice of his intention to visit her. But this servant was not left to enter Mária Talján's house. Instead, she came out herself and said that she would not be at home for her relative's visit because she would go after her lover to make love with him. In 18th century Hungary, state was represented in everyday life less by its central organs, say royal administration, than by the county, say noble administration for short. The county was on the one hand the regional self-government of the privileged, who amounted to approximately 5% of the population, but petty nobility did not take part in local or national politics. It was a privilege of the gentry and the aristocracy. While on the other hand, these elected officials of the noble self-government represented the state in almost all of its functions on the regional and local level. Robert Edwards, an eminent historian from Oxford, interprets the history of Hungary in the 18th and 19th centuries as a conflict of these two bureaucracies, noble and royal. Enlightened absolutism did much to extend the scope of central government, controlling much of the economy, of education, and also church matters. But these efforts were either only partially successful, or they were successful only in the long run. I think we can justly claim that neither royal nor noble bureaucracies could run the country only themselves. Let us turn back to Kaposmérő. Ignác Taljan brought the events to the attention of a minor magistrate of the village who ordered György Horváth to be observed and also captured if he would leave the courtyard of Mária Taljan's house. He emerged from the widow's room as late as 9 o'clock in the evening. The watches asked for his pass. György Horváth went back to the house under the pretext that his pass was there, but of course never re-emerged. When the villagers wanted to take her out and escort him to the magistrate, 4 of Mária Taljan's serfs, armed with sticks, prevented them from doing so. But at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, 3 or 4 peasants entered Mária Taljan's house. One of her men secretly showed them György Horváth's shelter, where he was captured after a short fight. He was taken out and given over to the soldiers of the county without Mária Taljan noticing what happened, without disturbing her sweet sleep. In this episode, we can see the representative of the local gentry drawing into the background and being content with trying to pull the strings. We see the soldiers of the county waiting in the street so that a supposed criminal be delivered to them in rows. Both let peasants take the foreground, the self-government of the village community. It is they who undertake the task of entering a noble household without any authorization, of capturing György Horváth by force, although he may not have committed any crime at all. These villagers, who can be seen members of a suppressed class, were ready to defend the order of their world. Without their active cooperation, the ancien regime would not have lived that long. While the Miller's case can present a claim to iconoclastic novelty, complete with all that Ginsburg stresses, subversion and the refutation of accepted beliefs, it is in need of supporting quantitative evidence. It calls for macro investigations in the field. The Guardsman and the Postmaster's cases both advocate a novel approach to the second half of the 18th century, a more sophisticated historical presentation of continuity and change, of things old and new, a more deep-going analysis of what brought the coming of the modern era, for example, of the Enlightenment. The landowners and the deserters cases are quite similar to these, since they suggest that the integration of Hungary into the monarchy of the Habsburgs and the workings of the Ancien regime might be seen in a new light. They call for cooperation with the macro approach. Having moved the machinery of historical knowledge one step forward, microhistorical analysis stops here and waits for the quantitative macrohistory to make the next step. Thus, subversion, preferred by Carlo Ginzburg as the use of microhistory, can be interpreted as the first stage of this process of cooperation. So what I suggest to you, or at least to myself, is cooking a new type of microhistory. The recipe goes like this. Get prepared by studying your period for at least a quarter of a century. Then mix macrohistorical arguments and microhistorical case studies so that the latter could add the historical actors' experiences and representations to the learned explanations of the social historian. Choose your microhistorical case studies so that they could represent the main historical problems of the age, say one case for each chapter, and explore these so deep that they could suggest an answer for the great historical question. And if you are lucky, you might end up with a dish that refutes earlier established historical knowledge and opens up new vistas for the research. Good appetite, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this attempt to show us the possibility of a national history built on the basis of the microhistory. One of the last sentences you told us something about a quarter of a century. You mean we should work actually a quarter of a century at first in order to begin writing a national history? I think I understood this question so. We should find at first a quarter of a century of our own lives to spend it on studying the microhistorical material in order to build then some sort of a national history. Maybe someone has not only questions but already ready statements, maybe about the situation with microhistory in Russia or elsewhere. No ready statements. I don't see any ready statements at the moment. We wanted to have such a statement who was to be delivered by Professor for coming here. We have another Professor Dmitriev here. Maybe he is able to deliver a statement on all possible crucial questions of our life. Maybe you have already some statement, or you should wait for a little before.
No, Professor Blantsov has forced me somehow to intervene, but I will do it with pleasure. Unfortunately, I came 40 minutes late after the beginning of your lecture. Therefore, of course, I cannot comment on the stuff you have worked on. Therefore, I'd like to limit myself to one question only. By the end of your lecture, you mentioned the famous name of Carlo Ginzburg, and last summer I learned that Carlo Ginzburg came to Paris to deliver a series of 4 lectures at the Collège de France, and all these lectures were, embraced, were summarized in one general title. So, well, structures through the prism of microhistory. Okay. Unfortunately, in principle, these lectures, I suppose, are available at the site of Collège de France. But then he also gave a very lengthy interview on the French radio, explaining his approach. And see, I'd like to ask you, for your opinion. Okay. Well, it seems to me, I will be a little bit skeptical, that microhistory over the last decades became a sort of refuge for all those people who say, gee, we are postmodernists, we don't want to make any generalization, anything is possible to know for sure in history, and the only thing which is available for us, which is feasible, is microhistory. We'll take one case, another case. Well, therefore, in my view, it is a very fruitless situation. And Carlo Ginzburg, previous experience, as well as his famous book Clues, when he suggested to look at the whole through the prism of one individual, for example, events on detail, is much more optimistic. Okay, and what he told in his interview is exactly of this sort. Okay, he says, see, I observed one of the rituals when he was traveling across in Mexico, and he decided to work on some rituals concerning so-called anniversary or holiday of death and of dead people in order to reconstruct a certain system of beliefs. That's what's your opinion? So whether actually structural events, and structural not events, but structural realities of history may be approached in a more or less fruitful, innovative, and relevant way if you regarded these structures from the very, very narrow angle of the microhistorical observations.
Begin the discussion, or what do you think? Should we collect questions or should we answer? I think
No,
we
let's
should rather answer
Right,
directly.
maybe.
Who would begin?
I think it was addressed to me,
But
especially this question.
before you start, let me just say you actually summarized my presentation quite well, even though you were absent during because I am certainly one of those who have looked at postmodernism as a positive force in historical writing. So I am, just like Carlo Ginzburg, I am not a pessimist, I'm an optimist, because I think history has a future. And especially if you look at the tiny little bits of knowledge we actually have. But let's get to that a little bit.
Sorry, but as far as I remember, Carlo Ginzburg was always against the presumption that microhistory has something to deal with postmodernism.
unique. Yeah.
He was always against this. George Brown was not. But
No, my point is I'm I'm full of, how to say, of respect and of veneration towards microhistory, because at least microhistory really gives us some more or less verifiable, reliable knowledge about the past. For example, my area is the area of the church history. I know for sure that, for example, I can learn, I'm in a position to learn something important about, for example, religious life of God, of the city Lviv, Lviv, Lemberg, Leopolis. So by the end of the 16th century, because there was an ecclesiastical confraternity, and this confraternity left a lot of archival materials, and therefore, at least for the confraternity of Lviv, I can learn a lot of things. Okay, therefore, I'm very optimistic in terms that, well, actually, well, microhistory is very nice thing. But on the other hand, my criticism against postmodernism was, well, directed especially towards, well, you see, university usages of it. So I was, well, in some situation confronted to students who were saying to me in the Western universities, Professor Dmitriev, there is no need, it doesn't make sense to make any generalizations, because we students, we know very well that everything what you have taught to us is nothing but construction. So therefore, don't ask me, please, during the exam, something from what you suggested. I will explain you my own personal view of the undergraduate or graduate students on things, because your constructions are of the same values as my personal observation of young men of the 20 years of age. Okay? In my view, it is exactly, well, the trump and the, how to say, the jeopardy of postmodernism. So microhistory is not about against microhistory, but against such, well, you would say, well, convulsion of the postmodernist approach to history.
I think Mikhail was right when he pointed out that my idea is that microhistory is not something for beginners. I had an experiment with my students, I don't know, back some 50 years ago. A couple of them wrote their master's thesis on case studies. And I discussed with them the possibility of publishing a book, a collection of essays of microhistory, and I had to realize that these essays were case studies, but in no way can I call them microhistory. Because I think that there is a difference, and this difference goes back to a question which was raised by my friend Szijártó Gylfi in his presentation, and that is the great historical question, or as Giovanni Levi prefers it, as we learned it in September, the general question. I think that original Italian microhistory clearly has a preference for generalization. So Ginsburg, Levi, and all these folks didn't want to study a single thing and then rest on that level, but they also had something big in their minds. If you have a look at the Cheese and the Verbs, it is not just about Menocchio, one single person and his ideas, but it is after Eurasian oral peasant culture or popular culture. So it has a big statement. It is just exposed through the analysis of a single case. And I wonder if Szijártó Gylfi mentioned it, but it was on one of his slides, the term incident analysis. It is a term coined by Robert Danton when writing an essay about the book of John Brewer, A Sentimental Murder. So Danton says that if we have a case study which is very well elaborated, but which has no claim to generalization, it is not a microhistory, it is an incident analysis. So I think that for students writing on a master thesis, or for persons who do not have the 25 years of research experience, which is still my case as far as 18th century Hungarian parliament is concerned, it's better not to write microhistory. Microhistory should be written when you have a general overview of the whole period, when you have a knowledge of depth of sources, when you clearly see the great questions, the great historical questions, And then you can try to give an answer through the analysis of one single case. And that will be, I think, microhistory, when the knowledge is born out of the microhistorical analysis. And as for postmodernism, you're quite right that the Italian school was against postmodernism. But as you know, microhistory, although invented in the 70s by Italians, it became fashionable in the 90s. It had an impact on French and German historiography. In the French case, it was mainly methodological and theoretical reflection. In the German case, it was quite close to the Alltagsgeschichte school, the school of everyday life, the school of the history of everyday life, which concerned with the history of the experiences of ordinary people in 20th century dictatorships. But the most important impact was on Anglo-Saxon, that is English and American, and mainly American in quantity, English and American history. And there, I think, we can find much more incident analysis than microhistory, and there the impact of postmodernism is much stronger. So there are people who are microhistorians, like Szijártó Gylfi or a lot more, who embrace both microhistory and postmodernism. But it is not already the original Italian historian's point of view.
So let me just add to this. As you have already figured out, I don't buy this argument of Istvan that you need to be an old person to actually do microhistory. I think microhistory is also for young people. And let me give you just one example. A student of mine found one document in an Icelandic archive, which was an autobiography of a peasant woman, a servant, from the 18th century. And this autobiography was 3 pages. And we just published a book. It's a young woman who actually wrote the book, found the document. And by focusing only on the case, only on this particular woman and how she went about doing her business throughout her life, she lived a very harsh life. She not only managed to argue against the grand narrative, she opened up a new vision on the 18th century history, which we didn't really know anything about. That actually the agency, this woman was an agent in her own life. She took important steps where she actually managed to do her business in a very positive and a constructive way, where the grand narrative kind of said then the peasant women, servants, they were, this was their place. They couldn't really move because the laws didn't allow them to actually have a private life, and so on and so forth. Istvan and I might actually be publishing this book in our book series. This is a young scholar, basically, and I think she made a huge and important observation using microhistory, only microhistory. And I think we can mention a lot of other examples where people with inexperienced people in historians are actually doing a very interesting stuff because they do not have these decades of training in appropriate academia. And I mean, let's face it, the institutionalization of history might be a problem. It is. I mean, it's strange to say that in an academia where people are actually functioning and doing good job, but we have to be open for criticism on the institutions we work in, because we have a tendency to actually direct people in certain directions. We train them for sure, and it's difficult sometimes for people to get away from that training, to actually look at afresh on research topics which they are dealing with. And that's basically what I've been arguing. You should try to shy away from the grand narrative, from the large structure. You should focus on the research you are doing. And I think you can do that in a very constructive way by looking at the environment which the person you are dealing with or the society you are dealing with, what kind of laws they are working under, what kind of structural orientations is part of their history. So, as you can see, we are on a different scale of the microhistory scale, but of course, our relationship as scholars is a good one, because we do accept the fact that when you are doing something like microhistory, there are totally different visions. Let me just add to the historiographical development of microhistory, which Istvan mentioned. I mean, I am not raised up with the Italian school. I was just a pure cultural social historian in my training. And it was not until the end of the 20th century that I kind of discovered microhistory. And it was because of postmodernism which I actually discovered it. Because postmodernism, of course, refused to acknowledge the grand narratives. I mean, they wanted to take the grand narrative down because the foundation wasn't very strong. The fall of the Berlin Wall called on a different perspective for scholars all over the world, whether it was socialism or capitalism. There were people who took the step forward and told their stories, whether we call it incident analysis or whether we call it just part of the life stories. It had a huge impact on, for example, Alltagsgeschichte, everyday life history, or microhistory. And that's what caught my attention, the way how we can actually use microhistory to do important studies on past time, put focus on elements which we haven't really looked at before.
Further questions or statements or ideas? Professor Tagoyo, please.
First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Olga Tagoyeva. I'm a co-editor of the Historical Almanac Causes, the unit on individual history. I brought you a very good present.
Thank you.
The last issue, the 10th one. But instead of speaking of Russian microhistory, I want to ask you a question. My first question goes to Professor Szijártó, because as far as I know, you have published a whole book about Russian microhistory, unfortunately in Hungarian, so could you please say us a few words about it and about your view of Russian microhistory?
Unfortunately, it is not a book about Russian microhistory. It is a book about Russia's microhistory. That is about microhistory written about Russia, and that makes a difference here. So actually, in that, Gylfi was so kind as to put it on the blackboard. But it's a tiny little book, something like 90 or 100 pages long. Not long book and tiny format. And although it deals with some articles published in Casus, it is much more about other authors' books on Russian or Soviet Russian history. Actually, I thought of speaking about at some length in a lecture on Monday. I wonder if that suffices now and here. But the main thing is that authors like Orlando Figes and Adam Zamoyski, who are both British, and their books about, on one hand, families in Stalin's time and Napoleon's campaign against Russia in 1812. So these books are mainly treated, apart from those few articles from Casus. So I have no overview, unfortunately, to make a statement about the state of Russian microhistory. I think we have people more better placed to do so here than me, so I would refrain from them. So.
Thank you.
I know you have mentioned some characteristic features, specifically for the Russian microhistory. I remember quite well the main idea of the Russian microhistorians is something, the personality, I think, a person under the pressure of the state or something like that, the possibilities to move along under this pressure. I do not remember exactly the formula you have used, but the idea, the idea is...
That is not our idea of microhistory here in Moscow.
But this is the reception from outside, yeah? How it is seen from outside. Okay, Professor Kosherev, please.
I was very much pleased when I learned about this round table and about all these lectures on microhistory because I am practicing microhistorian and just my brains are in this way. And I was surprised by this event because to my mind, speaking about our days, and Russian microhistory were in great decline in this area, though in the 19th it was the situation was rather different, and now we have only a small group in the Institute of General History, and our small group and some more persons because. And I just want, and I'm just thinking about the reasons of it. And listening to your speeches, I have some ideas which were coinciding with mine, and it was very interesting. The first of all, I think that the idea of pedagogics, which I read in one of your articles, is rather interesting because our students know nothing maybe now about microhistory because it can be only maybe in historiographical courses. Microhistory does not suit for dissertations or for some sort of works which demand conclusions. Great conclusions on great history. And that's why those, I know, young people who had come to me with some interesting cases and said, well, what to do with this? It's very interesting, but we do not know what to do, and it's impossible to do some work which can be presented as dissertation or something like this. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, the operation of historians who I don't know how to name them, who see the process in whole and so on, and those who said that there is no any use of microhistory because there is no any results for great ideas about historical movement. And you mentioned the works of Robert Darnton, who is, of course, the great microhistorian. We have the book named "We Start to Stop Kill the Cats," and written by Evgeny Popasov. Now he's American, I think, historian. He lives in St. Petersburg, and he is and was very influential, and he wrote several works against microhistory, and for the moment I do not know any historian in St. Petersburg who is doing some microhistorian researches, and the same, maybe I'm wrong, but and the third item is you also mentioned about the very influential historian thought and I think it's the approach of American historians who are exactly against historical works. They do not suggest students to take such topics. I know it just from the life and Russian students mainly now go to study in the United States by Fulbright, by IREX, but not in Ireland, not in Hungary, not in Poland or somewhere else, but especially in the United States, and they come back from the idea that microhistory is dead now. This, to my view, to my mind, the situation is for our historians is so, and probably I will be glad if we'll speak about it more, and maybe it will be interesting for people who do not know much about it. Thank you.
Thank you for this statement.
Can I just follow up on it? Because I think you're right in the sense that you know the American historians haven't really caught up on the microhistorical approach, except those who actually do European history.
Yes, sure.
I mean, Natalie
Yes,
Simon Davis.
for instance, or
Yeah, Robert Danton and Natalie Simon Davis are great examples,
Yes.
and we know more people who are doing microhistory on the European topics. But
yeah, I know Americans very well, and they're my friends, and it's nothing personal.
No.
Nothing personal, but really some of them, especially those who are on Soviet history,
okay,
they have special views on historical methods.
yeah.
Projects and historical
We are back to the institutionalization of the discipline. I mean, it is difficult in America to break away from the will of the institution. The universities actually picks people who they think fits to the program, and that's not people who are gonna take microhistory on their agenda. I mean, that's the problem, I think. Even though it's well known within American Europeanists, it really hasn't caught on in American history. But that might be changing. And I think postmodernism changed a little bit their vision, in the sense that, you know, people were willing to break down categories like class, ethnicity, race, which are dominate the American agenda. So I wouldn't be surprised if the American market would open up. It's like soccer. I mean, it's difficult to introduce soccer into American sports world, because America is not a world on their own, and they don't really need anything else in their own opinion.
Exactly.
So I think, you know, I think we are actually, we don't quite see the development in the same way. I think Istvan has more thinks that American historians are more willing to accept the microhistory than I do. But I do think, if I look back, when I came to Iceland, there was no one actually doing microhistory there. And I wasn't doing microhistory when I arrived back from school in America. But the sources kind of directed me into this direction, because the archives were full of material which I couldn't really see how I could deal with without using microhistory. And I just started to teach it. I took my students to the archives and said, you pick a diary which no one has looked at for 200 years, and you take a collection of letters, and let's see what we can do with it. And a lot of them actually never left the archives, because there is so much stuff there which, you know, is difficult, complicated to deal with. But microhistory is a good way is a good method of dealing with complicated sources. But the quantity of it needs to be limited. The scale needs to be reduced. If you are, you know, otherwise you are going to be in archives for the rest of your life, and nothing is going to come out of it. So I think, you know, I think microhistory has a great future in this great country. And I'm sure that those who are going to be doing microhistory, they are going to meet a heavy opposition against, you know, those who actually run the institutions. Except if they are really, really broad-minded, as we might have in this school here. But But I think, you know, this is something which, you know, people pick up, not as a path or something which just is on the top of the list. It's just because it fits well into their research plan. And that's how microhistory actually are doing well around the globe, in that sense.
Just to stick to the tradition of contradicting Sigurd de Gylfi, he advocated that you should go to the archives and write microhistory yourselves. Instead, I wouldn't say that education is bad. I would rather suggest that you go and study microhistory in itself. We are in fact working in a project to establish an English language MA in international collaboration in microhistory. And some institutions are seriously interested in this project. One of them being, of course, the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. But maybe Russian partners will also be included in this project. And I think to study microhistory is a splendid way of studying history. Because microhistory is interesting. Microhistory gives you experience. The historical experience is never so vivid than in the case of microhistory. And I think it is my firm conviction that studying microhistory, you're not cut from a general level. You have ties to the general level, as I tried to demonstrate here. And as for what Professor Košeleva said, I think that case studies are acceptable as doctoral dissertations. In Hungary, this is the case, I'm sure. So maybe a student interested in a very interesting source material, and although I'm convinced that if someone writes a text at the age of 25 or 28, it is probably not the best microhistory, but still it is an acceptable case study or incident analysis in Dartmouth's terms. And why not publish first? Why not present and then publish a doctoral dissertation as a case study? And there is a way to go on and develop it into microhistory later on. So I don't see here a contradiction. And instead of arguing against higher education, I think that we should develop microhistory and the case of microhistory through higher education and maybe in cooperation with Russian partners.
Thank you.
I have a question for Dr. Szijártó, and it might seem a little naive, but it seems to me that historian who intends to trace some patterns in grand narrative, who seeks to contextualize his microhistorical research in some grand big context, he needs to believe in historical progress. So do you?
Why? Why is it necessary to believe in progress? I didn't get in what reason.
Well, because it seems to me that probably I didn't get your idea of great historical question, because it seems to me that your effort to answer great historical question on the basis of microhistorical research presupposes that there is some tendencies, I don't know, that could be illustrated.
Not necessarily progress.
But probably progress and tendencies are not the same also.
Of course not. Of course not.
But anyway, as for the matter is concerned in general, I think that the term great historical question is opaque, and it is deliberately so. I think that what is a great historical question? This is something depending on the time, the place, and the culture. If I go back to Budapest, for my colleagues there, something might be a big problem. For example, the formats in Hungary, the 1830s. For us, it is a very important period, very important because it's formative in national history. It is whatever precedes the revolution of 1848. But this is, for an American historian, certainly not a great historical question, and for you, similarly, this is a non-existent problem. I think that, and that was the reason why I chose this term a few years back, that if you speak about a great historical question, you should know that it is depending on the historian's community to decide if a problem is considered to be a big problem or something very negligible. The usual fault made by historians arguing against microhistory, that they suppose that something is micro, it means something little, and it means something insignificant. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago I was presenting a paper at a conference, and the title was Microhistory in Hungary. And the keynote address was presented by a former president of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, Professor Glotz, a historian. And of course he saw the program and saw the word microhistory. And so he argued long against those insignificant little things and those miserable historians who have nothing better to do, just to dig into the, I don't know, dust in the archives and saying something little, while he said we should ask for global trends, big problems, etc., etc. And of course, the case is generally so in conferences. When I had the chance to present my paper and reply, he was gone. So he will never know that having a microhistorical method does not bar us to address big problems. There is a global history, and there is a global microhistory as well. A number of colleagues, including Ginsburg in the latest, I don't know, 15 years of his life, are interested in global problems and doing microhistory. It is possible. Ginsburg has a person called Jean-Pierre Curie. I think he was a 17th century figure, and through his life, Ginsburg tries to speak about colonization and the global trends of the early modern period. It is possible to speak about global history through the approach of microhistory as well. So what is a great historical question is dependent on the scholarly community.
And what about progress?
What is the question about progress?
Can I address to the point you are? Because I think you have a point, a good point there. Because a lot of historical studies has to do with the modernization process, and it is has a lot to do with progress. Modernization is, the modernization theory is a theory of progress. So again, I think microhistory has an opportunity to actually break away from that grand narrative, which the modernization theory is, and deal with progress in a very constructive way. So I think your point is well taken. Okay. There are many hands on in the area.
Thank you very much. So I have two comments, one a smaller one and one a larger comment. The smaller one deals with the United States. The United States, right. Because what you said, what was heard in the room, that there is no microhistory in the United States, which I would say is, to my mind, profoundly wrong. But here we come to the question that Professor Magnusson criticized the idea of disciplines, traditional views of how history is taught. Well, the same goes for new terms that we invent and build borders. That might not be simply called microhistory, but you mentioned in your presentation the ideas of history from below up in the 1960s in the United States, in America mostly, mostly in America, and that shifted. And in America, I think, the United States, in North America, the shifts in topics chosen for dissertations, books published later, the shift is more I would say, historiographical trends are more visible than in European history. There is less tradition there. And most historians shifted to studying social history to the extent that political history was, I would say, neglected. And social history would be initially history of groups, but the groups would be microgroups. The further you go, the smaller the groups become. And there are so many books written about also taking into consideration the dearth of sources, the large amount of sources about, say, widows in a county in these 10 years, in, say, New England in the 17th century, and there are dozens and dozens of books like that. Just simply not calling it microhistory, telling about, not even discussing the methodology of research. So they might not call it, they might not be subscribing to clinging to a field, but just doing it. And second, the larger comment. I was participating in a project which is concluding now in the Institute of World History. That is the World History in 6 volumes. The 6th volume is now in print. And I was actually participating in the preparation of the 5th volume, which is on the longer 19th century. After the, unfortunately not that long as we would like it to be, the French Revolution is in the 4th volume. We started more or less from 1800 going to the First World War. And when we did research on what they've done in this field, when the idea of the world history in 6 volumes, just in 6 volumes, was launched, everybody was more or less skeptical in around 2008, 2009, because you don't need world history in the age of Wikipedia. You cannot talk about large generalizations. Large trends and theories are all gone. It's the 20th century past. So the best thing we can do is just assemble material like in Wikipedia, but make it smaller, whatever. And then people started to work, and it became much more interesting during the process. To the extent that I think that we caught unexpectedly a kind of a trend in contemporary historiography. Jürgen Osterhammel from the University of Constance recently wrote a large, but he was the only one. He wrote it without any co-authors like us, but he wrote a history of the 19th century, and he was invited to become in fact, the founding editor of the same series published by Beck in Munich, and then translated in English, or vice versa. So it's a combined American-German project translated by Harvard University Press, and this is the same world history in 6 volumes. Chronologically, a bit different from us, but not that different, and it's still in the process. David Armitage and Joe Goldie in the History Manifesto, which you probably know, which was published very recently by Cambridge, stated that we need more historical education because people with historical education have a capacity to view large strands, mega trends, long-term processes, just like Fernand Braudel taught us. And this is why historical education is needed for political expertise. And this book was in fact planned to be discussed, right? So what was planned to be a sensation or something like that. Yuval Hariri published A History of Humankind in 1 volume. So I think that there is a demand today in the world to reassess large trends, whatever you talk about modernization or other things. And in fact, the very founding fathers of structuralism, of the ideal progress of certain lines that we have, did have understanding of contingency, not only of necessity. And Karl Marx, when you read the Communist Manifesto, it's really about classes and you don't see people there. But when you read the 18th of Brumaire, there are just people there who are acting just what you showed in your presentation. So my view would be the following. First of all, there's more microhistory than is called microhistory, not only in the United States. And just recently in our conversation before, I mentioned I would say, a strong British tradition, which is not called a tradition, which I think that there is a tradition of combining in one research, probably what you said, what you mentioned, combining the minute attitude to detail with a view of the larger trend, what you call a large historical process. So I think that today this demand is a renewed demand for large historical generalization after post-structuralism, after postmodernism, after we understood well the limits of the reification of notions like class or whatever, race, of all notions. They are all reified, they should not be, they are just constructed by us. The criticism of grand narratives of national history, which is the most simplistic grand narrative, but there are more complex ones. But that doesn't mean that there are no trends, I think. I think that even postmodernists would not argue with this reasoning, that there are trends that do exist. And here I think side with Professor Szijártó, that makes it work, I think. Not forgetting what you say, that of course every question is a great historical question, simply from the theological point of view, that every minute in the life of a human being is theologically informed, of course.
Would you like to respond?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I mean, there is a huge market out there. I mean, we live in a globalized world, and there is a huge market on demand for big books about big histories. And but I mean, and my old professor Peter Stearns, I mean, he has been doing world history for a long time. I taught world history, and I mean, in America as his student, as his graduate student. And you know, I'm not saying it doesn't really have any meaning. I think it has a market, and an important market. But I don't think historians should necessarily be. It shouldn't be considered historical writing. It is something else. It's a medium. You are actually you are doing something different than historians should be doing. That's my argument. But I mean, don't get me wrong. No one else would accept my argument. I haven't really found anyone who is willing to accept the singularization of history idea, because it's a radical model which kind of insists that you cut on the big questions, that you leave them somewhere behind if you can.
But you wrote a history of Iceland.
That's right. Because there was a market for it. I mean, the publishing house calls me up and says, "Hey, you are this microhistorian. Are you willing to write a synthesis on Icelandic history?" And I said, "Well, yeah, why not? You know, because there is a market there." And I suddenly, instead of writing for 15 people in Iceland, you are writing for 15 millions around the world. I mean, this was a book which you could buy literally around the world. It was everywhere, basically. And it happened. It was a good marketing stunt by Reaction Books, which published the book. They actually put it on the market right after the Icelandic volcano stopped all airplanes in Europe. So, you know, people were picking up the book, you know, that was the same month that this came out. So it got a review in The Economist, for example. And so it became, the audience are there. And I mean, that's the reason but my attempt was to actually try to write a micro-historical studies where I used on this specific form of history. Another point you made, which I think is an important one, and that's something which Eastman and we have repeatedly found out after our book came out. There are people who come up to us and say, "Well, yeah, I didn't really realize that I have been writing microhistory. I thought I was writing, you know, cultural history or social history or something, but in fact I am doing some sort of a microhistory." And that, I think, I mean, one reason of lifting the subject up, as we are trying to do, I think a lot of people are going to realize that there is a methodology which is called microhistory, and I think it is interesting through education or just to actually get to know what it is all about.
Would you respond
I would just
contradictory to everything that
I would just like to say thank you to you, because you've given me a very good point. I have not yet pointed out that one of the authors who is supporting the best evidence for my thesis is Szijártó Magnusson, because that book you mentioned is a social and cultural history of Iceland in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's a very good book, and I wrote an essay, a review, so it can be really read what my opinion is about that book. So it is a perfect example that it is possible to unite in one text the microhistorical approach and an interest towards the general questions, in this case, the national history of Iceland. And instead of repeating myself and earlier things, I would like to add one more aspect. I think it is useful to distinguish between microhistory and microhistorians. I personally do not think that at maternity wards in hospitals, certain babies are marked with bracelets that microhistorian, and this person is from the birth to the death a microhistorian. You mentioned microhistory in America. I was present at a conference at Duke University in November, and it was preparing a special issue of the Journal of Modern and Early Modern Studies, also published by that university. So it was a conference of microhistory, basically. And one of the authors, the proposed authors, couldn't come, but he sent a letter. And in that letter, he pointed out that although he had earlier published a book, which is clearly microhistorical, he doesn't think of himself as a microhistorian, because it was only a certain stage in his career. Earlier, he published different books. Now he's interested in other problems, but at that particular time, being confronted to that particular source material, he actually did microhistorical research and published a microhistorical book. So I think that although I am not a microhistorian myself, maybe I will be right enough, like the cheese in Pinocchio's case, that worms will emerge, and maybe there will be abuses, and they will help me to write microhistory, for example, on the Hungarian parliament in the 18th century. I think I'm interested in microhistory, and there are persons who are not self-confessed microhistorians, but also interested in this approach. And
you're still too young to write microhistory.
I'm almost 51, so I have a few years, but I hope I will be able to do that one day. So I think it is possible to be just an advocate of microhistory without being a microhistorian. And it's possible to be a historian who has already went on to other subjects and other interests, but still has one microhistorical book in the curriculum vitae. And for you also, it is possible to be interested in microhistory, to study microhistory, even to have ideas about writing microhistory without calling yourselves microhistorians, which might be, of course, dangerous in some countries.
Very dangerous, very dangerous. Yeah, I have an impression that there is one difference, important difference between those books that can be labeled as microhistorian books on the one side, and those thousands, or dozens at least, dozens of books about widows in American counties and witches in Salem and such sort of literature. And it is the position of the author. The author's position, because normally the microhistorian is eager to oppose himself and his approach to something. First of all, to the ground narrative to some sort. If he is consciously opposing himself, then he can be microhistorian. If he doesn't know that there is something that he should oppose against, he is not microhistorian. Possibly, well, I don't know. Those people who do not know that they are microhistorians, they are not microhistorians, because microhistorians are, in some sense, always rebels, I'm afraid. And so that's why they can be dangerous, and that's why they could be, oppressed, suppressed in some societies, as Ishmael has just mentioned. But there was, please, yeah, certainly. Mr. Wolski, professor.
I have a question to both colleagues. I am very much curious about terms. So we have to distinguish between microhistory and macrohistorians, and what else? For instance, case studies and microhistory. Do you use both terms? And what is the difference or no difference at all in your eyes? I guess we have just started to discuss this issue. We slightly touched it on Academy Jubens Istvan, but we didn't come to the point. I would like to continue. Thank you.
My short answer is the great historical question. If the historian, besides doing a case study, has the intention and makes an attempt to use the microhistorical investigation to give the answer to a general question, called the great historical question, then this is microhistory. Without this, it might be considered to be a case study. And I don't want to say that a case study is an infant, an imperfect microhistory. I think it is something apart, and it might be very good, and it might be even better read than some microhistory. So I don't want to say it is something bad, imperfect, or juvenile. I just want to say it's something different, a case study and a microhistory. And for me, the dividing line is basically the great historical question.
First of all, thank you very much for your point about the institutionalization of the discipline, because so far I have heard it only from below, from the students. They were discussing this question, and you are the first professor who points out this problem, and probably the only one. I don't know. So I think it is quite important to bring in new topics from new social environments, probably. Second, I wanted to address to Svetlana's point about progress when she came out. I don't know. I think it is an interesting thing, but I would say that institutional history requires from us believing in progress, and microhistory could oppose to institutional history in this sense. So these are two polar points of view. And the third thing is, I think I know of one example of a microhistorian from the 19th century, and Andrei Seref already mentioned him. It is Karl Marx, and I remember his first volume of The Capital, and I think that there are very brilliant passages, and I would say they may be considered as microhistorical when he speaks about small communities, Scotch communities in Britain, and also when he speaks about individual workers and their relations with the owners of manufacturers. And I would like to ask you both whether you could consider this example as a microhistorical research or an attempt of microhistorical research, and then Marx goes to broader generalizations, but not historical, and rather socially theoretical generalizations. So I think it is a very nice example, which follows totally to the recite that Dr. Szijártó showed to us. I just wanted to ask for your opinion about it, this example.
As I'm from Hungary, which was a socialist country till 1990, I got my first degree in economics at the University of Economics, which was called Karl Marx University. And I remember the first year of my studies there, where we all had the obligations of reading huge passages of Karl Marx. And I know that the impression was that this guy could not write. So it is unreadable. Maybe in German it is better. In Hungarian translation, it's completely unreadable. So as far as your question is concerned, I already can give you the answer as a series editor of the series Microhistories, which is now being launched by Routledge in London. That if Karl Marx sends a manuscript about Scottish communities in England or whatever to us, I will definitely be against its publication.
Well, actually, Iceland is not a communist country. It was not a communist country.
Still.
Yeah, still. I mean, but I knew a lot of people who believed in communism or socialism in Iceland. But I didn't really meet a real socialist until I went to America. And the universities there are, you know, they are packed with Marxists, and I think they are still alive, as far as I know. But I can't really answer you this specific question because I don't really remember specifically what he wrote about in this instance. But I think, I mean, the moral of our story here is that a lot of stuff has been written which might be considered micro-historical or has the potential to become a micro-historical stuff, something with a material for micro-historians to deal with. And a lot of social history which was done, for example, in America, on small communities especially on small communities. I mean, it was a trend in America to deal with, for example, social mobility in small, isolated villages in America. Intermobility, you know, was the American dream a fallacy or a truth? I mean, American historians were caught up with this question for 10 years or 15 years. A lot of it can be considered, you know, very close to how micro-historians do their stuff. But, and I think we can go back in history and look at historians who have been dealing with, for example, cultural or social history, which is kind of similar to what we are really discussing here today. But I think the most interesting thing is to go into the archives and find material, get to know what we are trying to preach in our book, what is microhistory, and use it on the sources. And I think I can almost promise you that you will find something which is totally different from what you are reading in mainstream social or cultural historical research.
May I add just one more comment about Marx? Maybe if you go up to Karl Marx and say that you are a microhistorian, that maybe you can convince him that he is actually, especially because he has the famous dictum that they do not know it, but they do it. So he used this argument himself. And it was my case with Lajos Fürr. His book was the first, which I mentioned. He was my former professor at university, and after 1990 he was on the government of Hungary. And when this government was overthrown in 1994, he went back to historical research, and on the basis of his decades of experience as a historian of agriculture and society of the 18th century Hungary, he published this book about the conflict in Bérce. And I went up to him and said that this is microhistory, please give it to me, because we have a new series in microhistory, I would like to publish it. And I could convince him. So he is a perfect case, like Karl Marx, that he didn't know he was a microhistorian. And I don't think he should be called a microhistorian. But the piece he wrote was exactly microhistory. So it is possible to make this difference, and perhaps in the case of Karl Marx it is useful as well.
Well, in spite of the communism in Hungary and communism in the Soviet Union, I would say that Marx was a brilliant thinker, first of all. And, well, microhistorian, I'm not sure that he would be very glad to hear about him, that he's a microhistorian. You can find wonderful elements of global history in his works, wonderful things. For example, this manifesto of the Communist Party, that's the wonderful sketch of globalization processes. So very modern text, I would say, in several aspects. But nevertheless, we are not going to offend or defend Marx and even Engels here. Who wants? Yeah, please.
I'm Jelena Klaasje, person for European University. I have a question concerning...
Also in Budapest.
Yeah.
But not the main university. Okay.
I didn't know that. So I have a question concerning these great historical questions. I completely agree with you that it's very necessary somehow to bound local cases with something macro level, because if we won't do it, we will have some tiny
issues about something that will be very difficult to prove, that it's really something important like history of tiny village in the middle of nowhere that produce special types of what, and well, you read some kind of such kind of research, you will ask in the end, so what? But on the other hand, when you're trying to find this concrete case where something like on a macro level, there is also a question whether you force this concrete case to be somehow correspond with great narratives and to national history or some trends that believed were that particular place. So because it's quite possible that this particular case wasn't in this list of this, like, I don't know, probably it went to fit to this frame. So, and you kind of force this particular case to fit the frame. That's the question.
I think that there is a well-known case of a tiny little village in the middle of nowhere, analyzed by a work which can be called microhistorical. It is Montaillou by Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. And it gives the answer to your question, because it is not that Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie had an idea about Middle Ages and forced his ideas on the source material. Instead, it was a beautiful source material, a very rich source material, and he asked the questions of the histoire des mentalités, the mentalities, to this source material. And from the source material, he presented in this magnificent book medieval thinking, how common people thought at the end of the Middle Ages. So my idea is, of course, not that conclusions come from the macro narrative and you force this on the case. Instead, you analyze the case. And then you will have ideas that have relevance to the macro level as well.
Without any presuppositions by historian.
But where do these presuppositions come from? They come from the 2.5 decades you mentioned. You work with sources. You have hundreds of cases. So your general ideas come from individual cases, but the scores of them, the deep research of these cases enables you to form general ideas about the period or about the problem.
But also your childhood, your education, your masters, everything plays a role in this presupposition. You are not depend only on your sources, I think. You see these sources in the light of your own personality, complex personality.
It is quite true, because if you are, say, 25, you go to the archive for the first time, what have you got in your head? You have your education, you have your professor's influence. You are told what to look for, what is important and what is not. And that's why, if you have the 2.5 decades of extra in the archives, after all this, it is not anymore determining that what you had at school. It is already your own research experience that determines your questions.
Thank you very much. I just have very small remarks. First, there was a talk about progress or organization, whatever, from Maria Alexandrova. Well, progress is a charged word, but we may just use the word change. And this doesn't mean that you approve of it. You might disapprove.
Fluctuation.
Change. And I think all of us agree that historians do work with sources and work in the archives, unless, well, if they do not like it, they are called journalists or political ideologists or whatever, a bad brand of what is sometimes wrongly called social sciences, of course. And then I think that the question is about talking about presupposition. I think when Professor Magnusson called us to be rebels, since 1968, many national traditions teach people to be rebels, and this is not to be a rebel, of course. Being a rebel is not a positive or a negative meaning. And what I think is important, you might find in the archive things that confirm that in fact testify the let's put it like that, testify the relevance of a grand narrative. That might be the case, and we should not view it as your defeat. So my point would be that when we read sources, we should try at least to be, well, let's call it freedom, whatever. So try to be independent. Try to having your background, not forgetting about it, having your knowledge, linguistic expertise, for example, your reading, whatever behind you, have enough freedom to try to step aside and to try to behave as if you were free from these presuppositions. But that does not mean, I think, that you are a rebel. You're just trying to be freer from presuppositions. Because being a rebel is also a presupposition. That you should say that everything written before is not correct. This is saying conformism, in fact, as a conservative type of conformism.
You were the one who used that name.
Yeah, it was me.
Blame it on me. But let me just take one point, which I think is important. It's the archive itself. How is that constructed?
Of course.
You know. So, and I think microhistorians, they are really concerned with the sources they are using, how they actually came about, how they were made, and how were they preserved, and
and what was not preserved or even recorded.
Exactly. So it's a good point.
Well, further questions, statements, questions? Are you satisfied? Professor Peter, are you satisfied with our discussion?
Well, it is such a passionating and important topic. I'd like to dwell only on one point. See, you can dispute about generalization models, microhistory, incidental history, and all that without any, hypocrisy or hypocrisy. In my case, it is very important. But there is a continuous big issue, big problem, whether historians either in the universities or in the academic, more strictly established institutions are able actually to produce what is called relevant knowledge. So relevant knowledge is more or less neutral term. So if microhistory produces relevant knowledge, nice. If Marx produces relevant knowledge, nice. If it is possible to bridge a gap between sociology and history, and such as historical sociology is producing relevant knowledge, nice. So, and the only question, how to distinguish between relevant and irrelevant knowledge. So I know that there are some debates about whether, Montagu case is actually a relevant example of the mentalities of the late medieval period, namely because, Le Roi-la-Durie, when he was quoting these sources, he didn't take the, the initial language of people who were speaking, okay? He was translating, okay? But of course, it is a case, it is a question whether, he was precise in all possible situations. But on the other hand, in order to decide whether there is relevant knowledge or not, it will be very interesting to ask you on Monday. As far as I understand, you will deliver a lecture about, experience of studying Soviet history through the prism of micro-historical cases, yes? Because you mentioned today
some thoughts about that as well.
But of course, for us in our milieu, what is particularly interesting, so do we understand, what was Soviet history in some periods, okay? I will not speak about, terror, about, I don't know, struggle for power within the Stalin Politburo, but let's take, a period which is, at least for myself and Mikhail Boytsov and for you, more or less, available for our understanding, late Brezhnev period or late Kadr period. So are there examples, my question is, are there examples, are there instances when historians recently have produced any convincing pieces of relevant knowledge in order to understand, let's say, society attitude, to the system, to the dictatorship of the party leaders. Okay, well, I will explain what is behind. So, well, once again, dealing with especially Western students, but sometimes now with the new generation of the Soviet students, I'm astonished to observe that the gap between, well, what we experienced, as far as I understand, so, and what they think about is growing wider and wider. I will give only one example. Well, 15 years ago, I was teaching a course, Introduction to the Polish History, to the students of the philology at the Moscow State University. It was a very such, more or less large, short cover courses. I have to touch upon, well, various subjects. And one of the subjects was exactly, well, Polish society and socialism, okay? And of course it's difficult to make people, well, who are not living in Poland to understand what Poland is. And I told to my students, you see, in principle there was Polish Komsomol, well, Communist Youth Organization. There was Soviet Communist Youth Organization. Therefore you can project what you know about Soviet Communist Youth Organization to the Polish case and you will have a certain idea. So, and in the context of such conversation, I asked, well, one of my students during the exam, he was in a difficult situation with the exam, how they understand what was function of the Komsomol cell organization, Komsomolskaya Yacheyka. And he told me without any doubt to spy. The only function of the Komsomol cell organization was to spy over all people. So, and to see whether Olga Tagoeva has told any political anti-Brezhnev story, or whether Alexei Grigorich has visited during the Easter period the church, or whether, for example, Olga Kosheleva is reading at home a book not on the Russian history written by the Soviet historian, but by Richard Pipes in the Russian clandestine translation. Okay? Well, and he was sincerely convinced in 2000 that the only function of the Komsomol cell was to spy. So, well, I didn't try to rebuke, but my question is exactly, well, it's especially interesting on Monday. So, whether there are examples of how either a microhistory or another sort of history has produced, well, new insights, new actually relevant insight, for example, in history of Hungarian society in the 80s, let's say, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, so, or in the 70s, and the same, well, maybe, maybe asked about the Soviet past, recent past. Okay. My impression is very pessimist, so, well, but I'm no specialist, so I'm actually, well, I'm wondering whether there are any examples when we, well, say, well, over the last, well, 10, 20 years, well, historians have produced some interesting studies about what is, for example, relationship between Soviet society, Soviet youth, and Soviet political institutions.
So the question is whether there is any Icelandic microhistorical analysis of Komsomol salad.
For example. Or Hungarians.
Maybe Hungarians.
I think actually my presentation on Monday is going to be a little bit about this. I mean, not this particular case, but I mean, how a new knowledge can be produced with microhistory, for instance.
I think that your term relevant knowledge is parallel to my term of the great historical question, because both are very flexible. And what is relevant depends on what you think is important. And when I was a student, someone told me that one of my friends was a party member. And I told him, no, it's not possible, he's a nice guy, why? And a week later, this guy told me, I mean my friend, that, hey, István, I'm really a member of the party. And later I had to learn that there were two in the group, and they were writing reports on a regular basis about the group, what was going on, what was important or not. And for me, as a non-party member, it was relevant. And I don't say that a communist party cell had no other function in society than spying, but for me, that was in that case, it was the relevant side of it. And as for your real question about new scholarly approaches to communism, it is interesting, but it is a fact that microhistory, if you have a look at the titles that can be, for some reason, qualified as microhistory, the bulk of them concerns the early modern period. Although you cannot say that for the 20th century, there are no sources. But still, it is more about the early modern period that microhistory is written. I have colleagues that try to follow in the footsteps of the Alltagsgeschichte school, that German approach that was first of all developed for the Nazi dictatorship, first on Bavaria, then about Germany. And there are, of course, German historians who later on picked up the GDR history, the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, the Soviet-controlled part of Germany. So there is Alltagsgeschichte about the Soviet period as well. And there are some colleagues of mine in Hungary who try to follow in their footsteps and produce articles, more articles than books, which are of an Alltagsgeschichte character about socialism in Hungary. As for microhistorical approach, I can only name one former student of mine, Agnes Nagy, who produced a very good book, which is combining microhistorical case studies and the general argument. His topic was the flat allocation system in the years of communism, although he started a bit earlier in the mid-40s and went up to the mid-50s. So it is not a Kader regime, it's rather Hungarian Stalinism, the Rákosi system. This book, for some reason, and I think there is good reason to call it microhistory, but it is only one side. It has a general argument, but it is based on series of very deeply analyzed case studies. That's all I can tell you. I have no knowledge of anything more.
Well, thank you very much. More questions, statements, remarks? I don't see any more. And if there is no statements, questions, or remarks, we shall say first of all, thank you very much.